before jumping into the details of the Bay of Pigs invasion, I want to make sure we understand the environment in Cuba and the United States leading up to the invasion. So, going into the late 1950s, Cuba was controlled by this guy right over here, Batista. And he was a dictator that was supported by the United States. And just to give a sense of what he was like, here's a quote from John F. Kennedy in 1963. So this is after he's already had the Bay of Pigs has happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis has happened. He is not a big fan of Fidel Castro. But with that said, in hindsight, JFK did say this, and this is, I think, a pretty objective assessment of what Batista was like as the dictator of Cuba. This is John F. Kennedy saying this. I believe there's no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. So even John F. Kennedy, in hindsight, is saying that Batista really was really not the best person, and it really was not a good idea for the United States to support such a corrupt dictator for so long in Cuba. And this is Batista right over here riding with some U.S. generals in a parade when he visited D.C. So you can imagine he was not a popular person in control of Cuba. And in 1959, you have a successful revolution against him. 1959, there is a revolution. And the revolution is led by this character, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, and his kind of number two, his right hand men are Raul Castro and Che Guevara, right over here. And they take control of Cuba. They're part of this nationalist revolutionary movement. Now, the one thing they do, and they are leaning from the beginning. People assume that they are maybe communist or quasi-communist. But even from the get-go, as soon as they take power, they start taking over lands that were owned by, well, one that was private property, private Cuban property, some of it that was United States property. Their argument would have probably been that this was wealth, that this was private property that was ill-gotten, that was gotten in the time of Batista. But they did it in a broad sweep. So they took over a lot of private land, a lot of private property, which also led to people thinking that, hey, this is not just a nationalist revolution. This is also a communist revolution. But you could also imagine that once they take over, there's this huge migration of Cubans to the United States, and it's primarily middle class, upper middle class Cubans, educated Cubans, who are really afraid of what Fidel Castro is doing in terms of taking over private land, taking people's property. So you start having this Cuban exiled community really focused around Florida and mainly Miami, and they're still there. And they're very unhappy with this Fidel Castro character right over here. So when we fast forward into 1961, John F. Kennedy becomes president. He gets elected in 1960, becomes president in early 1961. We're now fast forwarding to April 1961. So John F. Kennedy has only been president for a few months. But you can imagine on a lot of levels, you have all of these Cuban exiles, upper middle class, educated, middle class Cuban exiles who hate Fidel Castro. He's taking over their land. He's turning it into looks like a leftist state. This is all happening within the context of the Cold War. The United States is afraid of countries falling to communism. It looks like Fidel Castro is a communist. So the United States, besides the fact that you have all of these exiles who want to oust him, the United States probably wants to oust him just because he's a communist, and they're afraid that he's going to align himself with the Soviet Union. So, in conjunction with the Cuban exiles and the CIA, and this right here is the director of Central Intelligence during the Kennedy administration, or at least the beginning part of the Kennedy administration. This is Allen Dulles. His brother is John Foster Dulles. Dulles Airport is named after, and he was a U.S. Secretary of State. They decide that they want to oust Fidel Castro. But they want to do it in a way, that the United States does not look like it's the one doing the invasion. So what they do is they plan an invasion where they'll take Cuban exiles, and they get 1,400 men to sign up. So 1,400 exiled Cubans to sign up to be kind of part of this CIA-backed, US-backed force to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. And a lot of this was based on the premise, and you can imagine this, and this even happened in the Iraq War, where the CIA, the American president, they kind of surround themselves with people who tell them, who one, give them a very optimistic scenario, a very hopeful scenario, telling them, look, we represent what the rest of the Cuban people want. They'll say, look, if we just start a revolution, Fidel Castro will be overthrown. The reality that came out, at least at that point in time, in the early 1960s, Fidel Castro was actually pretty popular with the Cuban people. And you can imagine he was at that time pretty popular with the poor people who did not have land. And now all of a sudden you have this I guess you could call him, leader for the people. And I don't know about his popularity now, but at that point he was probably a lot more popular than the exiles and the CIA would have had Kennedy believe. And so they plan this attack. Kennedy says, "Oh, if we can get rid of Fidel Castro, then that de-risks the possibility of having this communist nation right off of the Florida coast." So they planned this invasion, and it's shady to begin with because they didn't want to make it look like an official U.S. invasion. They wanted to make it look like it was a pure Cuban counter-revolutionary, and to some degree that really kind of mixed up everything and made it look well, and it really was suspect because they really were doing something that was not what it really was. But the invasion, the way it all worked out is that by April 15th, and this is just going into the details of the invasion. So they had the 1,400 exiles. They had some ships, some planes. They marked them. They either removed the markings so that it didn't look like they were American ships or planes, or they put false markings of the Cuban military so that it would cause some confusion or whatever. And so on April 15th, 1961, and remember this is only a few months into Kennedy's administration, they start air attacks, and these air attacks launch from Nicaragua, and they go to Cuba. And the whole point of these air attacks are to kind of soften the Cuban Air Force for an eventual invasion by the 1,400 exiles. And so you have 8 aircraft, 8 bombers leaving Nicaragua. They bomb Cuba at a base outside of Havana, and a base near the south, actually not too far from current Guantanamo Bay. And the point, and their goal was to destroy the Cuban Air Force. It turns out they didn't do it. And once again, they did it to kind of cause confusion. They did it under the markings not of U.S. bombers, but they put Cuban Air Force markings on the planes to cause confusion. You had 8 planes going and doing the bombings. One of them gets shot down, and a 9th plane actually leaves from Nicaragua, and they falsely put bullet holes in it to look like it was hit with anti-aircraft guns, and had it defect to Florida. So I guess the idea behind this was to make it look like there's a Cuban pilot who takes off from Cuba or somehow gets out of Cuba with a Cuban plane. That's why they put the markings there, and then tries to destroy a bunch of Cuban aircraft, and then defects to the United States. That's the impression that they wanted to convey. It's not so clear that the Cubans actually fell for it. And so that happened in 1961. Most everyone kind of saw this as a U.S. attack, or at least said they viewed it as a U.S. attack. And then you fast forward to the night of April 16th, which I haven't written over here. April 16th. And this whole time, everyone was expecting a U.S. attack, and this is one of the things that it all gets. It all leads to the fact this was not a well orchestrated series of events. Is that it's pretty well established that some of these exiles, were just not as tight-lipped as they should have been about the invasion. It got out. It got to Soviet intelligence. The Cubans knew that an invasion was imminent. So on April 16th, you have kind of a false attack. a decoy attack at Bahia Honda right over here, which really just a bunch of decoy boats with loudspeakers on them that made it sound like they were firing and to cause confusion. And it did temporarily cause Castro to look in that direction because they were kind of on hair trigger notice, expecting an imminent invasion, but that wasn't the real one. This was on the evening of April 16th. But then when you go to the early morning of April 17th, you have the real invasion, where you have the 1,400 Cuban exiles with CIA and U.S. military support, but all of that was hidden, to actually invade at the Bay of Pigs. And this right here is the Bay of Pigs. And to make a long story short, it was kind of the invasion did not go well, and it has been blamed on bad planning, on incompetence on some parts of the invasion. If the invasion lasted from April 17th, this was the first day of the invasion, but by April 19th, essentially the invading force, the counter-revolutionary force, the 1,400 Cuban exiles, had been pushed back to the beaches. And for the most part, a little over 100 of them were killed, and most of them, over 1,000 of them, were captured. So over 1,000 captured. And then later on in the year, Fidel Castro, and some were executed after being captured, but later on in the year, Castro makes a deal with the United States where he hands over the captured exiles to the United States in exchange for $58 million in aid and supplies and all the rest. So this, at least from a military point of view, was a complete debacle from the United States point of view. And when you could imagine after this happened, people in the United States started pointing fingers. You have the CIA, and this is Alan Dulles right here, and the exiles blaming the Kennedy administration, saying that, look, he wasn't willing to do what it takes to actually do a proper invasion. He wasn't willing to provide the proper air support once the invasion started happening. He wasn't willing to commit more U.S. troops once the invasion started looking like it wasn't going in the direction of the exiles. Kennedy, on the other hand, blames the CIA. He says, look, this was just done. This was planned incompetently. And he also says that you gave me all sorts of misinformation. You told me that once the invasion started, that there was all sorts of resentment against Fidel Castro and it would cause this broader uprising, which never ever happened. And so this is actually a quote from John F. Kennedy that he said after the Bay of Pigs invasion. The first advice I'm going to give my successors to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn. This is John F. Kennedy saying this after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, you can dig deeper and figure out who probably was in the right here. But the bottom line is that it led to all around negative consequences for the United States. After this, it kind of strengthened Fidel Castro's hold on Cuba. He was like, hey, that was the United States' best shot. Huge embarrassment for them. It allowed him to concentrate his control. It also caused him to now become very openly communist. And also, he was now, before the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was kind of trying to get the U.S. to somewhat like him, although they wouldn't like him because he was taking over private property and he was clearly left-leaning. But after the Bay of Pigs invasion, he definitely aligned himself closely with the Soviet Union. He became much more open about being a Marxist-Leninist communist state. And because he was afraid of future U.S. invasions, he was open to what eventually leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the Soviet Union actually placing ballistic missiles, with nuclear warheads in Cuba at short range to the United States. So it set up this whole series of events that really didn't work in the U.S.'s favor.